Connor, Sarah, thank you for inviting me to talk about some of the work we've been doing on cochlear implants. I have been going up to the School of Medicine in Indianapolis each week for the last 24 years. I drive from my home in Bloomington a distance of 60 miles each way, and I go up every Wednesday to study a very unique clinical population. These are profoundly deaf children who have received cochlear implants as a medical intervention for profound hearing loss. This is a very interesting clinical population to study for a number of reasons, and one of them is that these children serve as a model system for us to study aspects of speech and language development following a period of sensory deprivation. In some sense, this is an example of what in the field of language development is called the forbidden experiment. This is the experiment, of course, which is unethical for us to perform. You can do these kinds of deprivation experiments with animals, and they do this all the time with birdsong. But these children provide a very important benchmark for us to try to understand the effects of early experience and activity-dependent learning. And that's one of the things that I've been working on. Now, cochlear implants have had a dramatic influence on deaf children, and now we have on their development, in particular their speech and language development, we now have in place in all 50 states in the United States universal newborn hearing screening, and babies are screened for hearing loss before moms leave the hospital, and this has resulted in identifying hearing loss at a very early age so that intervention can be implemented as soon as possible. And of course, now infants are routinely implanted under 12 months of age in many centers around the country, and the standard of care is not only one implant, but in many cases, often bilateral or 2 implants. This biomedical device has had an enormous impact on language development and speech and language and cognitive development. In fact, it's been suggested by Blake Wilson, one of the pioneers in the development of cochlear implants. He recently won the Lasker Award for his work on processing algorithms for cochlear implants. This is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And he said a couple of years ago that cochlear implants represent one of the great success stories in modern medicine, and that the cochlear implant is the most successful neuroprosthesis developed to date and exceeds by orders of magnitude the number for all other types of neuroprostheses. There are a very large number of children as well as adults who have received cochlear implants, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them, derive enormous benefits from their implant, and certainly in the case of children, most of these children wind up being mainstreamed in schools and become part of the hearing world. Let me first leave you with a couple of messages. We believe, my research group believe, that it is important to emphasize that the ear is connected to the brain, that the ear is part of a system linking auditory sensory input with cognition. A second message I want to leave you with is that hearing loss, and this is a quote from a woman named Carol Flexer, who's a well-known audiologist. She's a clinical audiologist. And here's a quote from Carol Flexer, that hearing loss is primarily a brain issue, not an ear issue, despite the fact that most of the people who work in the field of hearing impairment are otologists, which is the medical specialty for hearing, or they're audiologists or speech and language pathologists. There are not a lot of neuroscientists. There are almost no cognitive neuroscientists who work in this field, which is unfortunate. And finally, let me leave you with the third message. No part of the brain functions on its own, but only through other parts of the brain with which it is connected. So we're talking about brain connectivity. This is a quote from someone named Willie Nada. My talk is going to cover some neuromyths that are in the media concerning cochlear implants. Now, most people think, from what they read in the media, that cochlear implants restore normal hearing, that a cochlear implant replaces a damaged or deficient auditory system. Well, this is partially true. Some aspects of hearing are restored, but there are many problems that patients have with cochlear implants, even patients who are doing very well, children and adults. For example, they have great difficulty listening to speech in noise. Now, we all have problems in listening to speech in noise, but this is often catastrophic for children and adults in noisy environments with multiple talkers. They have great difficulty understanding speech from non-native speakers of English. And again, many of us have this kind of problem. They have difficulty talking and listening over the telephone. And finally, they have difficulty understanding and appreciating music. So cochlear implants, while they restore some aspects of normal hearing, it's probably not correct to say that it is a substitute for the damaged auditory system. Okay, a second neuromyth in the field is that earlier implantation is better. As a general rule of thumb, the earlier the intervention is implemented, the better the outcome. But this is not always true, and there are, unfortunately, examples of infants and young children who have received their implants at a very early age, and they show poor outcomes. The people who are working in cochlear implants, the otologists, the audiologists, and the speech-language pathologists, do not have very good explanations for why a patient, either a child or an adult, has a poor outcome. This is sort of one of the holy grails in the field, trying to understand the enormous variability in outcomes, and in particular, doing something about a patient who has a poor outcome. Poor outcome meaning they do not derive any benefit in understanding and recognizing speech. That's the main outcome measure. Okay. Related to this is another neuromyth, which is that everyone benefits equally from cochlear implants. When you look around the United States and then you go to Europe and in other countries, every cochlear implant center at a large medical school reports the same finding. There are enormous individual differences in outcomes following implantation, and people have a great deal of difficulty trying to explain the source of these individual differences. When you rule out the obvious candidates, related to whether there is a problem with the internal device, the device that's implanted inside the head, or you rule out that it has something to do with the external device, the processing strategies, and so on. There's not a lot of alternatives that have been proposed to explain the outcomes. We have been arguing for about the last 10 years that the variability in outcomes reflects brain function, okay? And this is very important because it opens up a new avenue to seek the causes of variability in outcome. Okay, another neuromyth, this is my fourth one, is that early experience doesn't matter. And what I mean by early experience is the environment in which a young child develops following implantation. There is now a great deal of evidence suggesting that an environment which emphasizes listening and speaking skills, that emphasizes spoken language, as opposed to manual language or sign language or a combination of speech and sign. This is a much better environment for a child to acquire speaking and listening skills. And there are special schools for the deaf which emphasize this oral tradition of speaking and listening as opposed to using American Sign Language. Okay, there is now, some of you may know, a very significant controversy in the field concerning these early educational environments. Okay, another neuromyth related to cochlear implants, something I touched on earlier about bilateral implants, that is two implants, and there's a general myth that two implants are better than one. As a rule of thumb, again, just like early implantation, that seems to be true. However, there are exceptions to this. For example, there are some patients who have received an implant in one ear and then, say, 5 or 6 years later, decide that they want to get an implant in their other ear. Those outcomes, what we call sequential implantation, are not as successful as implantation of both ears at the same time, say, in a little infant or young child. Okay. There's another a myth that is floating around in the literature, and that is that cochlear implant users, both the pediatric and adult population, have better visual spatial skills than normal hearing age-matched peers. And this is related to this myth that if you have a deficit or a disturbance in one sensory system, the other sensory systems take over and show some advantage. And I put this in the category of a neuromyth because there is now a growing body of evidence suggesting that there are delays and disturbances in visual sequential processing in deaf children who have received cochlear implants. And when I tell people about these results, they often scratch their head and are very surprised to learn that deaf children with cochlear implants show problems in visual processing of sequential information. That's important. Okay, and then finally, let me sort of wrap up here with the final neuromyth, which is that deaf children who receive cochlear implants learn language in the same way that normal hearing children learn language. They're just delayed. And one reason that I think of that as a myth is because, first of all, there is an enormous amount of variability in these children. And second, a deaf child, even a deaf child who is doing well with their cochlear implant, is different fundamentally than a normal hearing child. They're not just normal hearing children who can't hear, okay? They have, their brain and nervous system have developed often in atypical ways following a period of, during and following a period of sensory deprivation. So that it's probably misleading to say that they acquire language in the same way that normal hearing children do. The fact that they do acquire a language, spoken language, that they learn to speak and listen, that they get mainstreamed into schools with normal hearing peers is, in the eyes of many people, a miracle, given the state of the field of deafness and hearing loss, say about 25, 30 years ago, before the advent of cochlear implants. This has been a major change in the medical treatment of children and adults with hearing loss.